I'm David Gornoski, and you're listening to A Neighbor's Choice. And today I want to talk about a topic that I've been working on and trying to develop into an article or a series of articles related to how the state retards the natural scientific revolution cycles that occur whenever the state is having such an involvement in the development of science. And there's a lot of pieces to how to unpack this. So I'm just going to just casually discuss some of the pieces that are in place in my working hypothesis as to why we lack such scientific breakthroughs as the likes that we saw at the turn of the 20th century when we had the development of a lot of massive progress when it comes to the combustion engine, the steam engine, space travel, all the different things that we had. And then it seems like we hit kind of a kind of detour where we've been stuck on equations rather than real technological development. And I want people to think there's a lot of reasons for why that could be. And I'm just going to try to connect a few of them. So I think that originally science was not done by the guy sitting in ivory towers advancing equations. And equations are very important, but that's not how you primarily shift new breakthroughs of scientific understanding. I think scientific understandings happen first through real observation of real natural phenomenon and then logical, consistent application and understanding of what's happening in nature. And then from there, you develop technologies, sometimes usually by accident. Engineers, electricians, people who are working in chemistry, and they stumble onto laboratory experiments that they then are able to replicate and eventually becomes technology. I think that's the fundamental thing that drives new physical science breakthroughs, and we lack them today. And we're stuck kind of in this obsession with getting masterful equations. Recently, I interviewed Sabine Hasenfelder, who is the author of Lost in Math. She's a theoretical physicist. She works in Frankfurt, and she worked on quantum gravity, and she wrote a tell-all book where she basically says there's an obsession with beauty at the expense of does it actually work, and that we've lost our way in physics because physicists are often focused on beauty to the detriment of real world application. And had a great time talking to her. And I go a little farther with that because I see some parallels there with the work of Thomas Kuhn, the great scientific philosopher or philosopher of science, who was famous for his coining of the term paradigm shift. Uh, and there's a lot to that. And then there's Rene Girard, who is an anthropologist that has influenced a lot of my work when it comes to social science. And I think both Thomas Kuhn and Rene Girard are very helpful in understanding why people get stuck on bad, outdated ideas about science. And so there are a few areas in which I feel like I just use as case studies in fields of knowledge that I think are severely held back because of the monopoly of state funding for science. A few of those areas include nutrition, okay, the study of nutrition and what is proper for the human body. I think another field is medicine. Another field is economics. And then another field, I believe, is physics. All of those are just examples, and there's a lot more, which they have a lot of great breakthroughs, but fundamentally there seems to be kind of a slowdown as if we don't know what's happening in these fields. And of course, we have to be meticulous in how we criticize what's going on. And I'm by no means an expert authority, but what I do is I look for patterns. I look for patterns across different disciplines to help inform why these things are happening. And in this case, I think Thomas Kuhn and Rene Girard are very helpful for unpacking this. So, for example, with Thomas Kuhn, he's very important for understanding how science actually develops in history. We have a common misconception that's kind of borrowed from Enlightenment thinking, in which the development of scientific thought happens kind of in this progressive linear plane of higher and higher understanding and just just a relentless march of progress forward. And Karl Popper was famous for kind of developing the idea that each scientist goes into the field and has this kind of strong criticism spirit that underpins a lot of what the average scientist is doing in normal science, in the sense that normal science is advanced by, according to Karl Popper's model of scientific progress, through people questioning everything about the standard paradigm of science that they're operating under. However, I think if we look at Thomas Kuhn's model, I think it's a little more accurate. Thomas Kuhn says that the average scientist in a field does not come in questioning the foundations of the reigning paradigm that they're operating under, but rather they take it on faith, the word pistis, faith, trust, that the reigning paradigm's presuppositions are correct, and that their job is to develop and fine tune the applications of that paradigm to develop it further and fully flesh out some of the details of that paradigm. So the textbooks, Thomas Kuhn says, are written like propaganda that are meant to not show you all the dissenting voices and it does not provide equal time between the evidence for and against the reigning paradigms of a science, but it shows you what the victors who wrote that history textbook have received from the victors who carried it down from them. And so, in that old adage, history is written by the victors, is very applicable with Thomas Kuhn's model for how paradigms operate in science. We have this popular conception that scientists just come in and they're just question the foundations of reigning paradigms, but they don't. The curriculum and the way it's taught, it's designed to give you the foundational standards of the physics or biology or whatever paradigm you're studying, as if they have been settled by history and the progress that we've been made. And then you look a little bit at the Minority Report, but you move quickly on to reinforcing the presuppositions of that reigning paradigm. And so Thomas Kuhn says there is a kind of faith that is taking place for the average scientist working out ordinary normal science. They are operating under a faith paradigm that trusts that those things that they take to be dogmatic or foundational to a scientific discipline are not up for debate, that their job is merely to advance and apply the reigning paradigm. Now, Kuhn is not making a moral judgment on this analysis. He's not saying, oh, that's bad. So he's not saying it's good or bad. He's just saying this is what actually is taking place in scientific discovery. Normal science is operating under a faith that the current paradigm is correct. And Thomas Kuhn goes on to say that paradigm shifts happen when a bunch of anomalies start to build up in a field that start to put massive credibility in crisis for that reigning paradigm. Observational data, experimental results that are opening up real serious cracks in the narrative of the reigning paradigm. And as those anomalies start to snowball, it opens up a crisis period in which minority reports are starting to pick up stronger and stronger social currency. And he compares this to a political revolution and how, when you have transitions of power between different regimes of government, they're not usually handled in a rational kind of, contract way, but rather there is absolute faith in one standard of leadership. And then it's quickly overnight, because of something snowballing out of control, is quickly dethroned in a revolutionary fervor, and a new paradigm, usually the one that was held by the revolutionaries to some degree, is quickly established as the faith to put your faith in moving forward. And I think this is a helpful model for understanding how paradigm shifts happen and how scientific revolutions happen. And this is a natural process. We see it throughout history. But what I think it has a connection to Rene Girard's work in anthropology. Rene Girard says that human beings are fundamentally imitational in their desires, so that most of what we desire beyond mere instinctual desires like food, shelter, mating, when we get past the instinctual side of the human experience, when we get to appetites and desires, passions, those kinds of things, most of that is governed by um, it's governed by imitation. It's governed by kind of absorbing what we perceive others around us having and kind of desiring. And so if they desire a certain car, we have passion for that car or a better car. Or we can also do it in a negative way. If they really love cars and we want to outdo them in what we like in terms of gadgets, we love boats and we always talk to them about how boats are better than cars. So there's different ways of mirroring desires from our neighbors, and Girard is helpful for understanding that. So what he would say is, what it would help, I think, Kuhn's model is that humans are mostly imitational, which means they're not just rational, objective beings that just come in there and challenge sacred cows and calcified structures of paradigms in any given field of knowledge. He would say that what mostly is likely is going to happen is groupthink is going to set in place. And so with Girard, he says that those cultures that we develop in groupthink, they maintain order by ritually expelling people who blaspheme the paradigm of sameness with some kind of display of difference that is too different for it to be tolerated in the unity of groupthink that is being established in a community. So what that means is it could be a community of science, it can be a community of a neighborhood, it can be a community of a message board, a political government. There's all kinds of cults or binding together, little binding groups that humans can be in. And those binding, that what we call religion, these religions are not good or bad necessarily. They're just the way humans develop tribes and groups. And they're based on a common assumption of certain sacred boundaries of what's acceptable in order to be a member of good standing in that identity group. And I think science is no different in this way. That doesn't mean that there's not rational, smart, genius people in it. Of course, there are science geniuses in all these different specialist fields. But just like any group of people, they are prone to get locked into groupthink and they're prone to get stuck into kind of consensus monitoring, wherein you feed the vitality of the group by expelling people who don't fit into the normalcy of what's expected of them if they're going to be a part of this group in good standing. And so we have Girard, we have Thomas Kuhn. They both help us understand what's happening in actual scientific fields rather than just this kind of popular assumption that every scientist is just kind of a bold questioner of established truths. It's just not the case. And in fact, the group's identity is often fed by ritually expelling or witch hunting against people who violate the consensus groupthink that's been established. And so that's okay, though. I mean, that's just natural. I mean, it's okay and it's not okay, depending on how that actually plays out in real world. But it has a problem. Again, it has a real big problem when you have a big government that is really managing the development and the funding of scientific research. So when we put government into place, we see how this paradigm shift cycle is severely retarded by the monopoly control of money and credit and issuance of research dollars by a central government. When we have a government that has a fiat currency and they're able to create credit out of thin air and then pump it into areas of the economy which are most politically expedient for them to pump into, like in the case with college, there's lots of free, easy credit pumped out that the Wall Street bankers are able to funnel into that sector in an artificial way, creates a lot of malinvestment, a lot of extra economic power and energy and momentum in a sector that may not have it so easy if they did not have that monopoly issuance of credit pumping them up and keeping them more powerful than they really would be. And so when when you have a monopoly on credit, it's going to contribute to making it harder for natural paradigm shifts to take place in knowledge. Because think about it, if money and credit is centrally distributed in a way that artificially props up university established institutions and the different peer review journals and textbook curriculum developers and science labs that are all connected to government funding, what happens is you're getting a monopoly of view of what's effective. And that monopoly view is easily deeply captured. I like that term, deep capture. I believe I heard it first from the guy who created overstock.com. I can't remember his name. If someone can recall for me. The CEO of overstock.com, he was good at explaining the idea of deep capture, which is that when you have a monopoly regulatory mechanism like a federal government, you're going to have it make it very prone for deep capture, in which the regulatory agencies are deeply captured to the very core of their agency with cronies of the people they're supposed to be being regulators of. And so when you talk about trying to effectively develop true scientific breakthroughs, you have a deeply captured regulatory system and a deeply malinvesting credit system that the state is introducing into the picture of scientific paradigms, which is going to severely retard the ability for anomalies to naturally build up and break through those old paradigms and give us better, more accurate pictures of science in different disciplines. And that's exactly what we see in these different fields. So like if I take those case studies again, with economics, we have the reigning economic theories that are pushed onto people who want to be economists. And all the most prestigious universities are going to be Keynesian economics, neoliberal economics, different models of central planning, which assume, they presuppose a kind of equationism view of reality, that equations are the fundamental truth-telling mechanism of science, and that it's okay to have a macroeconomic theory that's completely disparate from a microeconomic theory. And that's what we see all the time in economics. That doesn't make sense to me from an Occam's razor principle. It seems like we should try to find a coherent, unified theory that makes sense, whether it's on a macro level or a macro level, micro or macro. It should be a consistent picture. And that's what we see in the field of Austrian economics, which incidentally rejects equationism as the fundamental epistemology for how economics should be developed. It says, okay, there is a place for some equations, but the primary thing that we should be looking for is logical consistency of what's really happening given human agency and given what we know about human action. And that's what we find in the field of praxeology, which underpins Austrian economics. And so I find Austrian economics to be true economics in the clearest picture in terms of the competing groups of thought. I think Austrian economics provides a much, much more logical, consistent, accurate depiction of economics than what is obviously going to be taught in the majority of institutions and peer review papers about economics. And I think if we were to adopt Austrian economics, it would never be adopted by the current paradigm that we have, where it's centrally planned through issuance of credit, which Austrian economics is going to show you why that's a terrible idea in the first place. And it's never going to be adopted by a monopoly state that manages science, because it kind of negates the reason to have a centrally planned monopoly state. And so it's inherently going to be anybody who's an Austrian economist tries to develop influence in academia or peer review papers is going to be blackballed and expelled because, again, going back to Thomas Kuhn, normal science under a paradigm is operated by faith, right? And that faith is reinforced by dogma, textbooks, which reinforce the reigning paradigm. And that's okay in and of itself, but not when you have all these other factors involved, such as what Girard says, which is that these paradigms of normalcy are policed by the ritual expulsion of people who violate the imitational resonant group think of a people group, right? And so you have expulsion of people in academia, the elimination of enemy others that violate the groupthink dogmas of a scientific discipline, right? And so that's what's taking place. Now you put the state involved, and it makes it even worse because now the state has central control over who gets what grants, who gets what research funding, who gets what $1 billion handout for some extreme expensive lab or nuclear science development. All these things are politically channeled through central state, deeply captured um, uh, central planners. They're deeply captured by the people they're supposed to be playing fair with, and they're rigging it to reinforce the reigning paradigm from being uh, shifted away from into a revolution. And so that's what we see taking place in science today. In economics, we see it in nutrition. For so long, the nutrition industry has deeply captured the nutrition science field. So they deeply capture who gets what funding and what peer review papers and what do the National Institutes for Health prioritize in their funding, how the FDA determines what's safe and effective for humans to consume. They develop, I mean, of course, universities are funded by tax dollars. The loans that students use to pay for those expensive degrees are funded and subsidized by the credit creation, which debases the taxpayers' purchasing power. All of these things are propping up the field of nutrition from having the natural paradigm shift cycle occur in a natural way where in a market setting, those anomalies would build up and people who are looking to get results because of price and profit and loss, they're going to be weeded out if they don't go where the accuracy of information, where the accurate data is leading them to. So in nutrition science, there's a lot of evidence that what they have taught and the food pyramid is completely backwards. That you don't want to have primarily grains as the means of your normal diet. There's a lot of health problems with having a grain-based diet, and yet that still is pushed by nutrition science. The reigning paradigm of nutrition science, propped up by the state, is still pushing grains, even though a lot of the data is showing this. It's a very, very bad idea to make that the primary means of nutrition for you as a human. And so why in a natural free market, when you don't have a monopoly issuance of credit, creating bubbles, and you don't have a monopoly of funding doling out of cash, um, when you have a natural free market, the paradigm would be disrupted quickly because you would see, wait a second, wait, if all this information is coming out that saturated fat is healthy and that grains are not as healthy, we need to go and develop, research to help develop that. We need to develop ways of expanding that field of knowledge as a more dominant paradigm in academia. But that's not going to happen when you have a deeply captured process in which the state is owned by the current paradigm and they have no vested interest to move away from it, when everything that is built has been built on, again, the Kuhnian faith that the reigning scientists and the normal science of nutrition have, and the Girardian expulsion of anybody who comes in that violates the groupthink of the reigning nutrition science paradigm. Those people have no incentive. They really, because of, if you understand, again, see, you have to understand, okay, what I'm doing right now, I'm using the science, using philosophy of science with Kuhn. I'm using anthropology with Girard. I'm using economics with Austrian economics, right? I'm using these different fields to explain why science is going wrong. I'm using economics, anthropology, and philosophy of science to show. And so if you're a specialist in that field, you're gonna kick and scream about what are you talking about that we're not governed by reason? Well, you are. You just have to see it. You have to map out the patterns of different disciplines to be able to see the bigger picture of what human nature is producing in these areas. When you have a deeply captured process like the state has, then the natural data that's accumulating to discredit the current food pyramid paradigm of nutrition would more easily break through a lot long ago, uh, many years ago. I think we would have already been able to break through that myth of the food pyramid, and we would have a lot more body of knowledge, a lot more economic investment in accurate understandings of human nutrition. We'd be farther along the process with a much more effective paradigm in place that focuses on saturated fat and that kind of thing as opposed to grains. And then, so that's nutrition. So I've covered economics, I've covered nutrition. The other one was the medicine. There's a lot of evidence that, and like for example, in cancer, that it's not primarily a nuclear issue, but it's a mitochondrial problem. So it's not a genetics focus where all the cancer research is being focused on, but it's actually primarily a mitochondrial dysfunction that is causing so much of the cancer. And yet there's hardly any funding, there's hardly any mention of a mitochondrial paradigm in the cancer industry and cancer research field. And again, that's because the state retards the natural paradigm shift cycle even worse than it already would be in its normal functioning as humans do. It retards it even worse from having exposure to a competing body of anomalies that discredit the old idea of, say, cancer medical research. So once you understand what's going on in cutting edge research in mitochondrial approaches to cancer, then you'll understand, wow, well, that seems very compelling. How do we get that developed? Well, you can't, because, again, because the state monopolizes the issuance of money all the way down from federal, state, and local. There is such a deeply captured process that it becomes almost impossible, like a gargantuan David versus Goliath task, just to get a little bit of inch of development of funding and understanding for a paradigm shift that can have tremendous health potential for people if it is allowed to develop in a natural market-based setting. And then the other piece, I think, is physics. And physics, a lot of the leaders of physics are even saying that we're at an impasse. There's one that I think he worked with the LHC, I believe, and he did a TED Talks recently where he said that, is physics dead? Have we reached the end of physics? And there's a lot of physics establishment people who say we don't know what's going on. We're at a kind of impasse here. And a lot of their work is focused on these beautiful, elegant equations. But meanwhile, we haven't had real innovation in terms of physical technological breakthroughs like we had from the 20th century, early 20th century. We haven't had a lot of breakthroughs like we used to. And the reason why that is again, because of, I believe, the state's retardation of the natural paradigm shift cycle that takes place in scientific revolutions. Because right now, if we had a competing, more free market based approach to developing scientific research, there are a lot of anomalies to the standard model of nuclear physics, for example. I'll give you one example. The Stanley Pons Martin Fleischmann experiment in 1989, in which they developed so-called cold fusion. Now, I don't believe it wasn't cold, of course, and it wasn't fusion, in my opinion. But they were chemists, some of the best chemists in the world at the time, and they developed real excess heat in a laboratory experiment. And they tried to, because they were chemists, they had to accept the pecking order that physics don't question the physics paradigms, right? So they had to just take whatever the physics paradigms were and try to explain what they were seeing, given the reigning physics paradigm of what's possible with developing excess heat in that setting. And so they believed, based on what they were accepting from their physics hierarchical masters, or, not, I don't want to say masters, but their hierarchical outranked them, I guess, physics did, in the pecking order. And so they were trying to explain how this excess heat would be produced through the nuclear fusion paradigm that they received on faith through their physics colleagues. And I believe that, they were ran out of town. They were expelled. Stanley Pons escaped into France and has disconnected his U.S. citizenship and refuses to speak to anybody in America. He was so viciously attacked. Now, they found some real world work, but the physics establishment really came down hard on them because they were trying to explain the events that they were seeing using nuclear physics, and it wasn't working. And so they just blacklisted them and smeared them and witch hunted them and made a mockery of something that was really taking place. And since then, there has been replication of their work and there has been excess heat production. I don't believe it's cold fusion. I believe it's something else, some type of low temperature nuclear reaction. But because they had to accept the nuclear fusion paradigm, which had been propped up by billions of dollars of taxpayer dollars and deeply captured by the paradigm operators in the regulatory process of doling out funds and credit for the development of the science, they had to operate under that paradigm. And so they could not explain the paradigm within the faulty paradigm that I believe was propped up by conventional state-funded science. And so rather than a natural process happening in a free market, if that happened and credit was more normal based on savings and market research was more decentralized in the way it was funded, then when they got excess heat, people would say, you know what, I'm more willing to dump more money into this field because it's going to be, it seems more promising than maybe these giant nuclear fusion reactors that governments prefer, in which are reinforced by the reigning nuclear fusion paradigm of science, right? And so if in a more free market, decentralized, polycentric model of funding, if they produce excess heat production, instead of being witch hunted so easily, I mean, there would still be that kind of thing, but it would be a lot more easier for competing minority dissenters to say, hey, well, maybe it wasn't nuclear fusion, but it was at least excess heat. We need to spend more and more millions of dollars developing and replicating what you were doing here. And don't worry about what to call it or whether it violates known laws of physics. We're just going to look to get things done. And if they had had that opportunity, we could have been a lot further along by now at understanding what that excess heat production was, how to maintain it, how to replicate it, how to scale it up, and how to make it an application that could help human beings in terms of potential use for clean energy or support and help for other technologies. So this is just an example I've showed you now with physics, with economics, with medical science, and with nutrition. Those are some big fundamental things, right? And we've shown you how those four fields are severely retarded they're retarded in the scientific revolution process that should happen if we had freedom. And so that's why we have to really think about it, because Girard says that all institutions are founded on ritual sacrifice. And I think that those sacrifices are still happening today in the sense that because the state is an institution founded on a violent expulsion of people who violate taboos of normalcy and groupthink, they're able to violently expel, sometimes really violently expel people from academic positions, from peer review papers, not even having a chance in the door. All of those things are severely severely affected by the sacrificial expulsion power of monopoly states managing scientific paradigms. And you'd still have expulsion. You'd still have groupthink expelling in a free market scientific field, but it would not be as powerful. It would not be as monopolistic in its ability to clamp down and stifle anomalies from building up and shaking the faith of normal scientists in a current reigning paradigm. So I hope that made sense. It's a lot of different fields that I'm pulling from to make this kind of picture for you, and I hope it made sense for you.